About 28% of older adults in the United States, or 13.8 million people, live alone, according to a report by the Administration for Communities Living's Administration on Aging of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, but many of them are often lonely or socially isolated. I've often been told that I'm an old soul. Perhaps my life as an environmentalist has been greatly influenced by injustice, but I cannot forget about the blood of my ancestors that speak to me on a daily basis. Elders play a huge role in movement building, and much of my work has inspired them today. And today I wanted to do a video about our parents' generation and the climate crisis. When it comes to the climate crisis, you sometimes may hear older generations didn't do enough. Have you ever heard someone say that or felt that way? As the climate crisis continues to make headlines, I've noticed that there's a consistently intergenerational blame directly at people who come before us. On its surface, it makes sense to assign blame to older generations. They came into power during a time when emissions could have been halted and climate action could have been the most impactful, yet the movement never manifested and even failed against corporate influence held by the same older generations, I should add. But that's not to ignore the continued existence of grassroots activists that have created legendary work for themselves. However, there is a problem with the lack of specificity in saying older generations and assigning blame in an ageist manner. If we want to be precise, we shouldn't say older generations didn't do enough. We should say leaders in large-scale corporations like the fossil fuel sectors have created a global environmental injustice that contributed to the ecological crisis that we're in today. And a lot of them are old, because the truth is that my parents that grew up in Mexico were trying their best to regenerate their homelands. My parents grew up as poor farmers and tell me stories about the continued struggles that farmers faced. So why does shifting language matter in these conversations? Eco-rage is among many valid climate emotions I've written about. Your emotions are valid, but they are not facts. They're based on our subjective knowledge and experiences. Our anger in the environmental movement knows no limit, and pain is deeply held. We must be careful in how we direct it, and we can shift our language away from ageist generalizations such as your generation's to blame toward more specific targets of generational wealth and the oil institutions it's held within are to blame. This paints a clear picture of who has contributed the greatest to the climate crisis. The people in power, most specifically in the United States and the global north, are frequently responsible for creating or lobbying policies that contribute to the mass degradation of ecosystems and by POC communities. While many of them do belong to the boomer, Gen X, and millennial generations, what happens when we equate this elite class to we the people? It's not in my interest to absolve our parents' generation of any wrongdoing. Rather, I seek to take an intersectional approach to environmentalism and discussions like this. Are older generations of indigenous people to blame for the climate crisis? What about older generations in Black communities to blame for the climate crisis? Or are elderly, impoverished Americans to blame for the climate crisis? When we use generalizations like older generations are to blame, we ignore the racial, social, and economic context. In one of my posts, I talked about just the wealthiest 10% of people in the world are responsible for over twice as much of the emissions of 3.5 billion people, which is why I do not say these types of statements anymore in my vocabulary. The truth is that there is some truth to the generalization. In our civilization, as you grow older, you can participate in the economic machinery, and you are expected to. We consume in a system that's leading to environmental destruction and the degradation of our communities for our survival and for our pleasure. The degree to which age influences climate impacts is tied to economic status. Research from the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research highlights that as Americans grow older, our average emissions increase. However, as we grow richer, our emissions also increase. These emissions curve mapped out in America stands true because of our country and our corporations are responsible for much of the pollution in the world, but it does not reflect the reality of many countries in the global south. This reminds us again that it's not a generational issue but a capitalistic one. How else could you have the equivalent amount of emissions as a car in your first years of life? I've often had to examine my preconceived notions founded in a colonized education system and question them. In this case, my emotions and education told me that I should be angry at older generations for leaving us within this world. However, with a climate justice informed approach, an important distinction is made that helps me more effectively build collective power within my community. Well, we all have an environmental impact. That's what a lot of people say. Yes, that is true. We do contribute in some way. However, we know in fact that many low-income communities contribute the least to climate change. There is often a myth that BIPOC communities don't care about climate change. The truth is that many of our families hold harmonious relationships with the land. And my parents grew up on farms in Mexico. They have so much wisdom, yet their wisdom and education were instantly devalued when they came to the United States. In conversations and panels, I expressed that this is an intergenerational movement and recognize that our parents aren't the ones who directly created this crisis. To devalue the history of grassroots activism taught by BIPOC is to ignore well-established history. Systemic change is one of the most powerful tools we cultivate from community-based frameworks. Being specific in our language, emotions, and work reframes issues in a more precise light. So when we look at our own friend circles, we have to ask ourselves, are there people that are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s in our social circles? For myself, I've made a really active commitment to actually build relationships with people who are 10, 20, 30, 40 years older than me. And while we may disagree sometimes on our theories of change, there's a collective understanding that we did grow up in different generations, but that's not to say that we disagree on who we are as individuals in this society. So taking care of our elders is part of environmental justice for me. My parents had me when they were much older, and as a young person in this space, having to take care of my parents who are very older, it makes me realize the passion of localization and the power it has to ensure that elderly people are still part of these conversations and that they matter in our ecosystems, which a lot of capitalism teaches us that they're seen as disposable. If you enjoyed this video about our parents' generation and the climate crisis, I highly recommend to give me a subscribe and let me know in the comments, what do you think about your parents' generation? I know for a fact my parents weren't responsible for the climate crisis, and as immigrants of color in these United States, they definitely have faced long amounts of struggle.